Well, in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams has a decision to make about the homeless. He has to decide if he'll sign the Homeless Bill of Rights, allowing the homeless to sleep in some public spaces. If he does, it would make the Big Apple the first U.S. city to do so. There's also a city council bill that would drop the rule requiring people to live in shelters for 90 days in order to be eligible for city-funded housing vouchers. The mayor is not in favor of that, saying it would burden taxpayers and limit resources for those in need. Eric Tarr, the legal director for the National Homelessness Law Center, joins me now to discuss these measures. Thank you so much for being here. Mayor Adams hasn't decided whether he's going to back the Homeless Bill of Rights, which, as we mentioned, would allow the housing insecure to sleep in some public spaces. What does this actually mean for homeless people? Is this something that the community and advocates support?
Well, I guess first let me say that safe, affordable, decent housing is a basic human right, and that no one working on homelessness considers enshrining a right to sleep outside in the law a victory. We're all working to make sure no one ever needs to sleep outside. And the fact that we're even considering this shows how far outside of the norms of human rights law we actually are. The right not to be cruelly and unusually punished by being criminalized for basic life-sustaining acts of sleeping and sheltering oneself in the absence of adequate housing is a right that we've upheld in court and may be what's being proposed here, but it's a starting place for the conversation, a minimum red line not to be crossed under the law, not the final destination, which, as I said, is everyone enjoying their full human right to adequate housing. The bottom line is that we need, as we say, housing, not handcuffs, as our unhoused friends at Vocal New York say, #care, not criminalization.
Yeah, so on that same note, Mayor Adams did ask a judge this week to relieve his city of the longstanding policy of providing shelter to anyone who wants it, and is against the city council bill getting rid of the rule requiring people to stay in shelters for 3 months before they can get those rental vouchers. Tell us a little bit more about the opposition to this, why that exists, and what the ideal scenario would be.
Well, for too long, we've seen communities that are using law enforcement or involuntary commitments to push unhoused people out of public view into jail cells or just deeper into the shadows. And that all actually makes it harder to end homelessness because it gives people criminal records, fines and fees that they need to pay before saving up for their security deposit. It breaks contacts with service providers. They trash important documents and IDs that people need to get services or employment. But that approach is more politically convenient because you can hide the costs of criminalization in the police budget, in the jail's budget, and you don't have to acknowledge it up front like you do for housing and services. But the fact is that actually, far from straining the city's budget, shifting to this approach would save the city 2 to 3 times over what their criminalization approach would cost. And so there are some upfront costs that need to be acknowledged, but just because you don't acknowledge them doesn't mean you're actually not paying them when you're housing people in jails, which cost $100 or more a night. So this is, the objections are just coming from political convenience, not from the evidence-based approaches that we know actually work to end homelessness.
Yeah, and so you mentioned criminalization. I think that's an alarming thing to hear for a lot of people. Last summer, Tennessee passed a law making it a felony if you were deemed homeless. Why are we seeing that become the solution? And are you worried that that's going to become more widespread?
Definitely worried. It has been becoming more widespread for decades now. As our communities have more visible homelessness in them, which we see because the costs of rent keep going up. As we know in New York, the rent is too damn high. We see more and more people stretched until they can't pay that rent anymore, end up out on the streets. We don't even have adequate shelters, as your previous reporter just noted. Even some of the non-congregate hotel shelters that opened up during the pandemic are now being forced to close. And so we're seeing more people out on the streets. And when there's more people out on the streets, you get this backlash. Let's push them out of public view as quickly as possible in a way that, as I said before, can hide the costs. And unfortunately, that's the kind of knee-jerk response we're getting. And then on top of that, you have politicians like Mayor Adams, like former President Trump, who are using very inflammatory language, fear-mongering around people experiencing homelessness, to encourage law enforcement approaches and vigilantism, like we saw with Jordan Neely. And so it's a really dangerous, dehumanizing approach. And what we need is to acknowledge that these are just our fellow community members who have become homeless, and it's our duty to help make sure that they can be safe and get back on their feet.
Yeah, Eric Tarr is Legal Director for the National Homelessness Law Center. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and sharing your expertise and thoughts on this.
Thanks so much, Lindsay.